This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Have you ever noticed how some nations build these huge empires of industry while others build, well, empires of the mind? Today we're diving into a historical puzzle that really gets to the core of the modern world. It's a fascinating story about three nations, three totally different ways of thinking, and one massive question that sets them all apart. Okay, so picture this. It's the 17th and 18th centuries, and Europe is just buzzing with change. Over in England, you've got the Industrial Revolution kicking off, literally changing the world with factories and machines. Meanwhile, in France, a political revolution is bubbling up that's about to completely reinvent the idea of a modern state. But then you look over at Germany. And what are they doing? They're writing these incredibly dense, complex, absolutely massive books of philosophy. So why? What on earth was going on in Germany that made them go down that road?
To get to the bottom of this mystery, it helps to think of this whole period as a kind of rivalry between three kingdoms of reason. You've got England, France, and Germany, and while they're all using the power of human reason, they're using it for completely different projects with totally different end goals in mind.
And this table here, it just lays out the whole rivalry perfectly. So for England, right? Reason was a practical tool. Think of it like a crowbar they used to pry open the secrets of nature for profit. And what did that lead to? The Industrial Revolution. Then you have France. For them, reason was more like an architect's blueprint. They wanted to design a perfectly logical, centralized state, which, as we know, eventually fueled the French Revolution. But Germany's path, man, it was different. For them, reason was about building a grand philosophical system, like a cathedral made of ideas, to try and create a kind of spiritual unity that they just didn't have in the real world. And that is what gave us German idealism.
So where do we even begin to find the clues for these three very different paths? Well, it turns out the evidence is kind of hiding in plain sight, sitting right on their national bookshelves. You know, what a country is reading tells you an awful lot about what it's thinking.
So let's do a little time traveling. Let's go back to the 17th century and see what was flying off the shelves in these three kingdoms. I'm telling you, the differences are just stark, and they give us our first huge clue to solving this puzzle. Okay, so in England, the big thinkers were aggressively turning away from old-school theological debates. All their intellectual energy was focused on the real, tangible world. You had Francis Bacon figuring out the scientific method, Thomas Hobbes designing a social contract from the ground up, John Locke defining property rights, and, oh yeah, Isaac Newton explaining the entire universe with math. These weren't just books, they were basically instruction manuals for building a whole new modern world.
French thinkers, though, they were obsessed with something else, creating the perfect system. René Descartes is obviously the key figure here. His whole idea was that you could use clear, logical reason, the same kind you use in geometry, to understand literally everything, from God all the way down to the government. Their books were blueprints for a society built on pure, rational design. And then we get to Germany. And this right here is the core of the whole puzzle. Because while England and France were branching out into science and politics and law, Germany's publishing world was almost completely dominated by one book and all the stuff written about it. Martin Luther's German translation of the Bible. The entire intellectual culture was just spinning around theological arguments. There was no pivot to the practical, no pivot to the political, just theology. So why? Why this huge difference? Why were German thinkers still so wrapped up in theology? Well, the answer lies even further back in time, with a single decision that basically fractured the entire intellectual inheritance of the ancient world. The year you need to know is 1567. This is the year the Catholic Church makes a move that sends these massive shockwaves across Europe, and it ends up pushing our three kingdoms down three very, very different roads. So here's the critical moment. When Thomas Aquinas was named a doctor of the Church, his work basically became official doctrine. Now, here's the kicker. Aquinas had masterfully woven Aristotle's philosophy right into Catholic theology. So by making Aquinas' work official, the Church effectively captured Aristotle. It meant that anyone who wanted to use Aristotle for secular things, like science or politics, suddenly had to find a completely new path forward. And this is how that great intellectual inheritance got split up. England, really pushing back against the Church's monopoly, grabbed Aristotle's natural philosophy, all his work on physics and the natural world, and they reforged it into independent, experimental science. France, they claimed his political science, and used it as the foundation for a rational, non-religious theory of the state. And that left Germany. Still deep in religious questions, they inherited Aristotle's ethics, his ideas about purpose and living a good life, which they then transformed into these massive systems of moral philosophy.
Now, this philosophical split is only half the story. To really truly understand why Germany went all in on philosophy, we have to look at the actual political map of Europe at the time. The answer isn't just in their books, it's in their reality on the ground.
By the 18th century, England and France were unified, centralized nations. Right? They had a shared government, a capital city, a common national project they were working on. Germany, on the other hand, was a mess. It was this chaotic patchwork of hundreds of tiny, competing states, still reeling from religious wars with no central power whatsoever. There just wasn't a Germany, in the same way there was a France.
And this political reality, that's the key, because Germany didn't have a unified state on the ground. Its greatest minds, we're talking Kant, Fichte, Hegel, they set out to build one in the world of ideas. They were trying to create a unified spiritual nation with shared values and a shared purpose, because they had no other way to create unity. Philosophy literally became a substitute for a state.
So all of this leads us to a pretty radical conclusion. What we usually call modern philosophy, these huge, all-encompassing systems that try to explain reality and morality and history from the ground up, that didn't really happen in England or France. It was a uniquely German invention, born out of uniquely German problems.
So you might be asking, well, if the English and French weren't doing philosophy in that grand sense, what were they doing? Well, they were putting reason to work on practical problems. In England, thinkers like Locke and Newton were laying the groundwork for science and liberal economics. In France, Rousseau and his buddies were designing a new state. It was only in Germany that philosophy was still trying to answer those ultimate questions about meaning that theology used to handle.
And this whole investigation, it reveals a much deeper truth, not just about Germany, but about the nature of philosophy itself. It suggests that philosophy is never really created in a vacuum. It seems it always has a partner.
And that partner has always been theology. You see, for centuries, philosophy was basically theology's servant. It was used to justify existing religious doctrines. But in the modern era, especially in Germany, it became theology's heir. It inherited the same huge questions. What are we here for? What's the nature of reality? And it tried to answer them without bringing God into it. That deep connection is just inescapable.
This gives us the precise conditions that give birth to this kind of grand philosophy. And get this, it isn't a sign of a healthy, stable society. It's actually a symptom of a crisis. It pops up when a nation is politically fractured and spiritually lost, when it needs to build a completely new foundation for meaning from scratch in the world of ideas. Unified, stable nations like England and France, they just didn't need it.
And that leaves us with a pretty challenging final thought. If this kind of grand philosophy is born from crisis, from a desperate search for new foundations, what does the state of philosophy, or maybe the lack of it, in our own time say about the world we're living in right now? That is definitely something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.